always thought Return of the Jedi was a weird name for this movie. Luke isn't a Jedi yet, and he's not really returning anywhere. It starts on a brand new planet. Yeah, maybe it's referring to Yoda. He's a Jedi that returns, but then so is Obi-Wan in the first movie.
Dad, you were viewing the second Star Wars movie, Episode 5?
Yeah?
That's not Return of the Jedi.
Oh, that's right. It's Revenge of the Jedi, isn't it? Well, that's even more interesting because...
No, it's The Empire Strikes Back.
Oh.
I have a bad feeling about this.
The following is an in-depth story analysis. If you haven't seen this film, you might want to before watching this review. The Empire Strikes Back is not a movie I ever would have thought to give myself to review. For one thing, it's so beloved and ingrained in our culture, it's a tough thing to discuss in this format. Like most of you, I'd guess, Star Wars was always present from my earliest memories. Like Tim Burton's Batman, it's a hard thing for me to look at critically because I've never really thought to criticize or analyze it. It's a thing I saw numerous times growing up, though not nearly as much as Batman. It wasn't a thing I was obsessed with or geeked out about, something I needed to know every single little nugget I could get my hands on about, like Star Trek, but it was always there. I can hardly imagine the original trilogy being any different, or at least I couldn't before I forced myself to talk about it here. Star Wars is Star Wars. It's such a classic, iconic piece of the 20th century, it had to go exactly the way it did, or who knows how history would have unfolded. Heck, without Star Wars, you couldn't have the Buffy theme. For better or worse, it shaped how action blockbusters, be they fantasy or sci-fi or whatever they are made, sold, and merchandised. It made the motifs of ancient mythical stories fresh again, such as the mortal who discovers he's really the son of a god, and the tragic hero with a fatal flaw that leads to his demise. The hero's journey story has been preserved over millennia in every sort of fictional medium, and of course, I'm constantly talking about those motifs in Superhero Rewind. But Luke Skywalker is arguably the most recognizable modern hero that so clearly returns to the roots of heroism in literature. There are an infinite number of stories told in every medium, influenced by Star Wars and borrowing those same familiar archetypes and life lessons, but all of it goes all the way back to antiquity. I'm not saying that Star Wars just ripped off better stories, because it's a great story, and it had a tone and atmosphere unlike anything that existed before it. So much of good storytelling is telling an old story in a brand new way, updating it and making it resonate with a new generation, and that's exactly what Star Wars did. Those old ideas keep being retooled because audiences continue to respond to them. It's not a testament to the lack of originality in Hollywood, and that is a problem to be sure, but it wasn't with Star Wars. That was a strange project the studio took a chance on. But rather, it's a testament to how little has changed in a few thousand years. We still love an underdog. We still dream of discovering we're more significant than we ever could have imagined. We still hate the idea that we are our parents. We all have a dark side we fight to keep at bay, and we all have to face the pains of growing up and making those hard, mature decisions that lead us away from a dark and self-destructive path. Star Wars works because it's a story that stood the test of time. Joseph Campbell argues in The Hero with a Thousand Faces that we continue to tell this same story over and over without even realizing it, that those ancient influences often aren't even conscious because it's such a timeless and forever relatable tale. Now, Lucas has said that he was thinking about Campbell when he wrote Star Wars, but that's not always the case. If you sent it back in time to Shakespeare, he would have recognized it instantly and adapted it for a stage play straight away with no fear of infringing copyright. So my point is, looking at Star Wars critically is like looking at Hamlet or Macbeth that way. I mean, sure you can, and you're bound to find something you don't like. Nothing's perfect, but you might not naturally think to do it because it's a thing that's held as such a standard to measure other things up to. And you can spend all day gushing over how great it is, but what can you say that hasn't been said before? In this case, I imagine nothing. but I promised I'd give it a go, so here I am. You may have heard some of what I have to say before, maybe all of it, but I haven't searched through hundreds of reviews to make sure what I'm saying is completely new and super profound. Perhaps I'll get lucky and, like Star Wars, say it in a slightly new and fresh way. The other reason I wouldn't have thought to review The Empire Strikes Back by itself is because it's considered to be the second part of a 3-act story. Not just the second movie in a trilogy, but the second movie in a proper trilogy that tells a complete story in serialized episodes. How do you judge the main action of a story without talking about where it's all going or how it got started? I don't like to think a bad sequel ruins the first movie, but I suppose it can if it's all one ongoing story. The last act of I Am Legend certainly spoils the whole pie. It's like eating a piece on Thanksgiving, but then leaving it out and trying another piece at Christmas. Now, I'm like a lot of people. I like The Empire Strikes Back more than I like Return of the Jedi, and I think some of the surprising revelations and setups for the conclusion are more interesting in idea than they are ultimately in execution when we get to them. Namely, the idea that there is another, and that's Luke's sister, and she can use the Force. But it's still a solid ending, and certainly doesn't ruin the rest of that story. And while in 1977, I imagine Star Wars was a fully satisfying experience with the resolution of the main story points of that film, if not of the larger narrative it's building, once you have the whole trilogy, it's nigh impossible to imagine that film without the rest of it. Star Wars was by no means a surefire hit, and when you look at Lucas's original script, it's amazing it came together exactly as it did. Some have even called Star Wars the most profitable accident in the history of cinema. But of course, that's what collaboration is for, and thank goodness Lucas did enlist the help of other creative people to help him realize his universe. That time around. Had the original film performed badly and Lucas couldn't get the others made, it probably would have built a cult following that would speculate forever about where it might have gone, much like Browncoats did after the cancellation of Firefly and even after its follow-up Serenity. But they would have continued to enjoy it as a singular entity with a beginning, middle, and end. There were plenty of mysteries to be resolved with what exactly the Force was, what Luke's father's relationship was with Ben Kenobi and Darth Vader, and who or what Vader was, and what he was after, besides generically keeping the Empire in power. But it watches like a complete piece, with a happy ending for the here and now, and it's a little like watching all the chapters to one sci-fi serialized story that might have follow-ups later. Watching only Star Wars isn't like watching the first hour of The Wizard of Oz and then never getting to see the rest of it. It's also really unusual for most trilogies in that the trilogy watches like a complete story from start to finish. That first movie still holds up okay on its own, but it was actually imagined as a trilogy in the first place. We've had a few since then that were all shot together, like The Lord of the Rings, but more often, like The Matrix, you get a movie that nobody was sure would perform, and then it's a phenomenon, and now there's pressure for sequels. Star Wars isn't like Back to the Future, a series that was transformed into a 3-act story, but wasn't initially conceived that way. So you've got a definitive, complete story, and now this larger, overarching narrative that ends up looking more like a movie with a 2-part sequel rather than a proper 3-act story. Though that one does about as well as I could imagine, given how wonderful an experience Back to the Future is by itself. And yet The Empire Strikes Back ends on a cliffhanger, just like The Matrix Reloaded and Back to the Future 2 would years later. And so, while the story is technically in 3 acts, one of those acts watches fine alone, and the other two really need each other to fully appreciate them. So there's still a bit of that separation between the first and then the second too. A lot more time seems to pass between A New Hope and The Empire Strikes Back than between the last two. The difference is that, again, you realize how much of that first movie is introduction and setup once you have all of it. And while some potentially exciting things happen off screen that books and comics have imagined and dramatized, most recently Jason Aaron in his Marvel Star Wars comics chronicling how Vader comes to discover Luke Skywalker is the Force user who blew up the Death Star, it feels like we're getting the relevant moments for the story Lucas and Kershner and company want to tell. It's also smart to allow some time to pass after the Death Star incident, so that A, it doesn't feel too fast and easy for Luke and his friends to cripple the Empire from the moment Luke gets involved, and B, it adds to the serial adventure feel to imagine that these are good friends who go on numerous adventures together together, and we don't have to see every moment they spend together to care about their friendships. On the other hand, I think Empire also works more as a standalone story than it's given credit for, though again, it's a very different and pretty depressing story if that's all we get. By the end of this movie, there's every reason to worry that Luke and Han might both end up being tragic heroes. First off, it does have its own natural break in status quo when the Empire discovers the rebel base on Hoth. Before that, Luke is already getting into major trouble and nearly freezes to death, but that's there to establish the film's moodier tone, to let the audience know that Luke isn't untouchable just because he destroyed the Death Star and is becoming stronger in the Force, and to establish Luke's ever-growing self-doubt. It's important that the galaxy be more dangerous and scarier than he imagined when he dreamed of adventure while on Tatooine. He had a massive taste of success and was living in a fairy tale for a moment, but now he's getting a massive dose of reality and discovering, as Yoda preaches to him, that anything worth having is difficult and that the easy path is the dark path. I suppose the other break in status quo might be Luke moving his lightsaber with his mind for the first time, but there's no real way to know if that's the first time that happens. The movie itself, I think, has its own three-act structure, signified by each planet Luke visits, which each symbolize a new stage in his character arc. In the first act, Hoth represents the cold reality our heroes are living in. This universe is fantastic and sometimes enchanting, but it's also ruthless and terrifying, something the green and impulsive Luke isn't ready to face yet. He dealt with some hairy situations in the first movie, but he always had his friends to help him, and so I don't know that they ever felt quite as real to him as some of the difficulties he faces here, even and especially including the destruction of the Death Star. Han saves him a second time at the very beginning, when he nearly dies from frostbite, and I like that Han keeps up his scoundrel's veneer with his line, "That's two you owe me," when he's now repeatedly demonstrated his compassion for his friends and that he's out for more than himself. But after the Walker fight, when Luke decides to go to Dagobah as Ben commands, he's on his own. He's had it super rough already, but now he's starting to feel really lost, alone, and in over his head. I like that when he gets to Dagobah, he says he doesn't know what he's doing there and that it's like something out of a dream. Becoming a hero is nothing like what he thought it would be. Luke's time learning about himself and the Force with Yoda is Empire's second act, and Dagobah represents Luke's lack of direction and focus, the swampy haze he has the whole time he's there. It also introduces the idea that things aren't always what they seem, harkening back to the lesson Obi-Wan tried to teach him before, that your eyes can deceive you and that you have to trust your instincts. A muddy swamp is the last place Luke would have expected to learn to be a Jedi Master, and Yoda isn't at all what he would have expected from a great warrior. Oh, excuse me, as Yoda says, war does not make one great. And it's amusing to me that Luke doesn't suspect anything yet when Yoda's throwing out those sorts of nuggets of wisdom already. The size doesn't matter lesson really justifies there being a second wise sage character, when originally Lucas had intended Ben to fill that role in both the first and second movies. Once you get over the surrealness and shock factor of Luke's test in the cave, Luke's struggle becomes more familiar and recognizable. His greatest enemy is not Darth Vader, but himself. It's these sorts of life lessons that help give these movies universal appeal, besides the grand spectacle. We all get in our own way from time to time, and more often than we like to admit, we have a tendency to make our own problems due to a lack of confidence, which, somewhat ironically, almost always leads to stupid, impulsive decisions. After he fails the test in the cave, and after he fails to lift his X-Wing out of the mud hole, he begins to make a little progress, but he hasn't learned enough patience or control to face Vader alone. Although now that I'm thinking about it, I can't help but wonder why Yoda doesn't just leave the X-Wing in the water until Luke believes enough in himself and the Force to lift it. I'm sure he hasn't seen the future and doesn't know Luke is going to be duped into a trap by Vader, but if Luke had no transportation, he'd have no choice but to stay. I suppose Yoda feels he has to excavate the ship to prove to Luke what the Force can do, and it serves as the completion of that object lesson. But he goes a little too easy on Luke, perhaps just to serve the next big plot point, so Luke has a way off the planet. It seems more likely to me that Yoda would fly the ship around with the Force for a while and then drop it right back in the hole to make Luke have to depend on his own abilities rather than Yoda's. But I guess the problem with that, then, is Luke might embrace too much of the dark side to lift the ship out of a sense of desperation once he knows his friends are in trouble, so Luke would end up learning the opposite of patience. When Vader lures Luke into a trap by torturing Han, I guess sure that he's strong enough in the Force to pick up on it, Luke defies Yoda and Ben both and rushes off to help his friends. Luke has had a clear opportunity for change here, and he hasn't taken it. He's a typical headstrong kid who won't take and doesn't understand sage advice until he's made his own mistakes. A lot like Peter Parker realizing what his Ben was talking about only after he nearly goes off on his own dark, vengeful path in The Amazing Spider-Man. This Ben alludes to the fact that most of us are impatient and emotionally driven in our adolescence when he says, "Was I any different when you trained me?" Yoda and Ben worry that Luke will be destroyed or seduced by Vader because he's allowing his emotions to rule him and he's putting his friends above the greater good. At first, I found it hard to see their side of this, which is great because it means that while Luke is being the impulsive teenager, I'm still sympathizing with him and seeing his difficulty in deciding whether to help his friends as a moral conundrum rather than looking at him as an idiot, whiny kid who isn't learning or growing. If I were in Luke's position, that would be my first impulse too. Wait, aren't we the good guys? Isn't saving your friends always the right thing to do? Didn't Han Solo just have this big character arc last movie where he found himself caring about someone else so much he couldn't bring himself to leave the rebellion, and he's supposed to be endearing because he did the right thing in coming to Luke's aid? Luke says, "I should just let them die," and Yoda responds with, "If you believe in what they fight for, yes." Normally, risking your own life to save your friends would be the right thing to do, but this situation is way different from Han and the Death Star. Yoda is warning Luke to recognize that Vader is luring him into a trap, counting on Luke being led by his heart rather than his head. He has to get way past, "I don't believe, that's why you fail," before he's ready to take on Vader. And so going there now is potentially walking into Vader's trap. I imagine this is the same sort of thing Todd McFarlane was trying to do with the impulsive Al Simmons and the ostensibly wise sage Cagliostro in the Spawn comics. I know that was years later, but going back to this after reviewing all that Spawn, it is nothing short of refreshing to see this again. Know what the heck the evil plot is that the good guy is apparently helping to facilitate through his recklessness, and to get it without the old wizard saying, "You're playing right into his hands," over and over again. So while Yoda encourages Luke earlier to do or do not, there is no try, Luke also needs to know his own limitations. So not going to save Han and Leia, according to both Yoda and Ben, would not be cold and unemotional, it would be keeping his emotions in check. Rushing off half-cocked and unsure of himself is just as dangerous as staying there and doing nothing. Maybe even more so. And yet, if I were Luke, I imagine I'd have a very hard time understanding that logic at first. I'm always saying that sympathetic protagonists are proactive, or their character arc needs to be about why they aren't, with consequences for it. But a character who constantly reacts without thinking and never pays for it is just as bad as a totally passive character. Also, the stakes are really high, and the side of good really needs Luke on his game and embracing all that Jedi wisdom because of how powerful he is. Yes, there is another, as Ben says. I'm really not sure why Yoda's not thinking of Leia, and prior to the prequel trilogy, I always figured there just hadn't been girl Jedis before. But anyway, if Luke falls to the dark side, Vader has his own evil apprentice and becomes that much stronger. Of course, Luke does what Han would do and comes to his friend's rescue, and that leads us to the final act in the Cloud City of Bespin, which I think represents Luke's revelation and wake-up call. I love that Luke loses his hand to Vader and discovers he is his father in what at first looks like a veritable paradise. This is what I might imagine the wondrous world beyond Tatooine might have looked like to Luke as he was dreaming of adventure, when his head was in the clouds, and the darkest, most real, most personally gut-wrenching moments in the entire trilogy take place in the clouds. I also like the amusing irony that a city in the sky is run by a guy named Lando, but we'll get to him a little later. Luke, I think, realizes the magnitude of what he's done when Vader reveals that he's his father, and in traditional supervillain fashion, invites him to join his side. At first, he reacts with the viciousness Vader hopes to manipulate, giving us a glimpse of what a raged-out Luke Sith might look like, but he ultimately manages to escape Vader's clutches. I don't think Vader's offer tempts Luke, really, but the news fuels his already boiling anger, which Vader no doubt hopes will consume him to the point he can't come back from it, as once happen to him. I like that Vader tries to appeal to Luke's sensibilities, but spins them dark, suggesting that he can obtain his goals and end this destructive conflict and bring order to the galaxy, as if that's the same thing as the peace and freedom Luke and the rebellion really want. So rather than going all Andrew from Chronicle, just losing it and throwing a super-powered hissy fit, Luke composes himself and considers his training, dropping down a huge shaft and using the Force to guide himself to a slide that, luckily for him, drops him out on a big TV antenna. He's made a mistake. He should never have come here in the first place, and I think he knows it. It's perhaps the darkest and broodiest moment in the trilogy, but it's also a huge character-defining moment of maturity. I also like that the movie just presents these events and choices to us and doesn't feel the need to spell out what's happening. And while I'm in that scene, I don't know if this is intentional, but it's also really smart to have a solid couple of minutes of action with no dialogue, so the audience is allowed to really process the enormous bombshell that's just been dropped on us. It's probably the most famous and most echoed and lampooned twist in movie history now, and I doubt if anyone new to Star Wars gets to experience it the way it was intended now, either because it's so ingrained in the culture or because new generations might watch these in episode order rather than in production order. But in 1980, nobody saw that coming. In fact, it was such a closely guarded secret that the majority of the cast didn't know Darth Vader was Luke's father until they saw the movie, including David Prowse, who played Darth Vader in the costume himself in the scene. It's remarkable that none of them predicted it. And it's such a satisfying reveal because it's well seated. When you go back to Obi-Wan's carefully crafted dialogue in the first film, which Luke refers to here, he's not exactly lying to Luke when he says that Darth Vader killed his father. It's certainly a cryptic interpretation, and he's omitting important, hard facts, but Anakin Skywalker is supposed to be a man who allowed his dark side to completely consume him, to the point that he is not at all the same person he once was, reflected in his mostly mechanical body, which Obi-Wan also mentions. He's more machine than man. Of course, the optimism of Return of the Jedi is the message that no man is beyond redemption, and there is still a good man beneath all the machinery. But I love the initial mystery surrounding Darth Vader, and then all the identity questions it brings up once we know who he really is. Remember that this is a universe where droids, though they seem to experience human emotion, are not considered people, and we have a man who has been kept alive through a metamorphosis into what is essentially mostly droid. I love all the very human moments with C-3PO and R2-D2 because of that. They're played mostly for comic relief, but there are a number of subtle and thoughtful moments where they seem to experience genuine awe or concern or pain or joy. Despite C-3PO's very pedantic and mechanical optimism, like when Vader performs the carbonite maneuver on Han and C-3PO tries to cheer everyone up by saying he should be quite well preserved if he survives the freezing process, at this point in the series, compared to the ruthless and unmerciful Darth Vader, C-3PO seems like a real human being. I also think it's interesting that C-3PO and R2-D2 are split up like Luke and Han, which gives each someone to talk to while he's apart from his best friend. But each of them does his best to help our heroes, whether you interpret that as loyalty or programming. Now, this may be reading way too far into it, but if it is real human loyalty, then C-3PO and R2-D2 were perhaps rewarded for it by being reunited at the end, after the immense hardship they endure, especially C-3PO, who's ripped to shreds just for being in the wrong place at the wrong time. He's like Luke at the beginning with all the terrible stuff that happens to him that he hasn't done anything to deserve. Luke and Han are both paying for past mistakes, and they finish the movie without each other and with uncertain futures, as opposed to C-3PO and R2-D2, who get to be together again. One of the big differences between the light side and the dark side of the Force is their respective attitudes toward technology. The dark side is all about you, getting what you want at any cost, embracing your most base desires and being ruled by them, and being accountable to absolutely no one. Control of everything without the self-control the Jedi preach. I see this idea encapsulated in the Walkers, these giant clunky machines that are easily toppled over and destroyed if you don't let them intimidate you. They're powerful and terrifying, but they have a clear fatal flaw as long as you're clear-minded enough to see it. Naturally, dark side Force users will exploit anything that brings them power with no thought to the consequences. The strongest survive and everyone else is expendable, as we see with the sheer number of underlings Vader painfully Force chokes whenever they fail him. They take advantage of the Force, while light side users see themselves as working with the Force. Using the Force is responsibly using a thing you were already a part of. Jedi aren't anti-technology, but they try not to abuse it, relying on their own natural abilities whenever possible, because as Yoda tells Luke during his training, luminous beings are we, not this crude matter. The material can't be relied on, and the dark side is greed incarnate. It's all about the material. So Vader is the living embodiment of the sacrifice of humanity a Sith makes in the name of power. He gives up who and what he is for unlimited power that will never satisfy him, and that is, we find once we get to the optimistic culmination of the whole story, not sustainable. In his haste, Luke loses a piece of his crude matter, his hand, which is symbolic of his failure to fully grasp Yoda's teaching. If he depends on the physical rather than learning self-discipline first, he'll become his father. He also pays for that by becoming part machine like his father, but only a small part, and there's an inherent optimism despite how bleak those final scenes feel, in that he has flesh and nerve endings in his new robot hand, which reflects, I think, the humanity he managed to retain when he chose to use his reason over his undisciplined emotion with Vader. There's still time for him to be tempted by the dark side in the last movie, but he's clearly learned something, and the new hand represents both what he's lost and what he's managed to retain. That's another trope that constantly shows up in other films now. It's not an arbitrary shock factor choice or gratuitous violence. In fact, the movie is inconsistent with its gore just so as not to freak out the children any more than they already are, since Luke has bloody gashes on his face after the fight with the Wampa, but none at all when Vader slices his hand clear off. You know what? I want a Wampa. I'd name him Willy. Willy Wampa. He also doesn't have the guy around that he's usually relying on named Hand, and he lost his Han, which sounds kind of similar to that, but that's probably complete coincidence, and I'm looking way too far into that. So on Hoth, we have Luke in pain. On Dagobah, we have Luke wrestling with his self-doubt. And in Bespin, we have a revelation for Luke that gives him a last opportunity for change, which he takes, but not before he pays for the mistakes he's made already. Solid character arc. I wanted to concentrate primarily on Luke and his hero's journey, but Han Solo also has an arc here that furthers his development from the first movie, and they're interesting to compare. Luke is a kid trying to figure out who he is, and Han is a street-smart guy, well, space-smart, I guess, who has done what he's had to in order to survive, wants to think he's only out for himself, but actually has a heart of gold and resists it. One of these men is trying to be a leader before he's ready, and the other is a natural leader but doesn't want to be. Both have a lesson about responsibility to learn. Both ultimately have to suck it up and do the hard thing, and both pay a price for not learning that lesson sooner. Han already proved he cared too much about his friends to leave Luke at the mercy of the Empire last movie, but on Hoth, he's trying to put himself first again and leave a rebellion he believes in and that desperately needs him in order to go deal with his debt to Jabba the Hutt. The moral quagmire for both of these protagonists is, should I stay or should I go? But Han, despite himself, continues to make the right choice throughout the movie, staying with the rebellion and helping his friends. And that's why Leia continues to fall for him, I think, even though he remains an egomaniac. He does have that same boyish, impulsive streak Luke has, which comedically gets him out of a lot of scrapes. There's a fine line between acting without thinking something through and thinking on your feet, and Han walks that line nicely. He retains the heroism he displayed last movie, but still manages to progress even further at the end of this movie, when he decides not to do anything crazy when he's captured by Darth Vader and put in carbonite. He's finally run into a situation he can't maneuver or con or weasel his way out of, and contrasted with Lando, who double-crosses him, won't do anything to jeopardize his friends' lives any more than they already are jeopardized. Luke's big consequences due to his own foolish actions. Han's is a personal sacrifice, but it's also a consequence of the sort of life he led before now. So even though he's changed for the better, his prior actions are still catching up to him and have consequences. Without his debt to Jabba the Hutt, Vader probably wouldn't have singled him out to test the carbon freeze on. Now, despite all these details I'm examining, Star Wars is a famously simple story, but with characters I find myself totally invested in. This movie nails making characters sympathetic while making morally ambiguous decisions, and never regresses characters to keep them squarely inside their initial archetype. Lando is a great foil for Han Solo, who also bridges the two subplots, both in that through the deal he makes with Vader, Luke Skywalker is lured there, and now the subplots converge, but also thematically. At first, Lando seems to be be the man Han is headed toward becoming, an upstanding, responsible leader who used to be a scoundrel. But very quickly, something's off when C-3PO gets blasted. We find out later because he saw stormtroopers there. So there's this great air of mystery and suspicion surrounding Lando, but surprisingly, once we find out that Vader has strong-armed him into double-crossing Han and Leia, I still totally sympathize with why he's doing it, even if I'm not meant to condone it. He's trying to protect what's his, and not just his own skin, but this colony and community that he's built. But then, at what cost? And that's where it thematically builds on Luke's conundrum of potentially sacrificing his friends for the greater good. Lando gives in to the Empire, and while he thinks he's doing the right thing, the message of the movie is that nothing good can come from serving evil. Not only does Vader have no intention of keeping any of his end of their bargain that he doesn't want to, but he's also helping to facilitate Vader's plot to control a powerful would-be Jedi. So everything that happens here is because two good men cooperate with evil, and in both cases, the argument is, I have no choice. Lando says that repeatedly. This goes back to Yoda's easy path leads to the dark side sermon. Lando, of course, works hard at redeeming himself, and a surprising amount of character building is done for him, considering he shows up right at the beginning of the movie's third act. So is there anything I don't like about The Empire Strikes Back? Well, even though she's a really strong female character who's a major leader in the rebellion and isn't treated any differently than anyone else, Leia still primarily serves the function of love interest for one of our protagonists. And the relationship is gradually developed and charming and believable, but she doesn't have any sort of arc herself beyond coming around on Han. There was certainly set up to make her a lot more prominent in Return of the Jedi, though you have to see that movie to realize it, but that wasn't really remedied there either. So that's more a fault of the trilogy on the whole than this movie specifically. And then there's the thing all these movies have where, even though there are plenty of consequences for people's actions, I'm never really afraid for anyone's life in a shootout where our heroes can mow down stormtroopers, but they can't hit the broadside of a tauntaun. Director Irvin Kershner laughs about that in the commentary and basically chalks it up to a trope of these sorts of movies. But that's a place where I think we might be having our cake and eating it too a little. It works in the first film in a way it doesn't work here, because that movie watches like pure throwback to sci-fi serials, only on a grander, big-budget Hollywood scale. Empire starts breaking some of those rules a little and reinvents that genre for a then modern audience. For instance, as Lucas says in the commentary, those serials didn't usually have a real love story. The girl would immediately fall for the guy because he's the hero, and then that was about it. So as we're turning tropes on their heads and defying expectations, it seems a little inconsistent to me that you'd have any action without consequence. But then Han getting out of tight spots through sheer luck is also a gag we're running with, regardless of how much heavier the material gets here, and that adds some much needed levity, so maybe I'm making too big of a deal out of it. Oh, and why are walkers impervious to laser blasts until you knock them over? Once they're on the ground, you can shoot them and they explode. I'm sure there's some extra movie supplemental source explanation for that, and I bet I'll get a bunch of comments explaining it to me, but just watching the movie, I don't understand how that works. I realize different Force users would have different levels of ability and that it all depends on concentration and force of will, so I'm not saying that we need a clear rule set for what powers you can use with the Force. It's clearly defined that the Force binds the universe together, and so sort of like in the Matrix, you should be able to do pretty much anything you can imagine if you're strong-willed and naturally talented enough. And as I said earlier, I appreciate that we're not constantly spoon-fed exposition, but then there are some places where things seem a little cryptic in order to move the story along. For instance, Ben comes to Luke while he's bleeding and freezing to death in the snow and tells him to go to Dagobah. Why are you telling him to do this now? How can you be sure he'll know it's really you talking to him and not a delirious hallucination? My wife suggested he might only be able to communicate with Ben when he's under deep stress or high adrenaline, that it has everything to do with Luke's ability to use the Force and that it's not just Ben coming to him whenever he wants to. And maybe that's what's going on, but he should at least be like, okay, finally I can tell you this thing you need to know. Oh, and I'm not a hallucination. Don't worry, Han Solo is on his way to rescue you and he's right behind me right now. I can understand not telling Luke that Vader is his father because he's too emotional and immature to know what to do with that news, but I'm a little confused on this one. A lot of people seem fuzzy on this one, and there are a lot of different theories. there's the question about just how far Vader's powers extend and how far away he can force choke people. He does it once over a screen in this movie. Is he able to do that because that guy was pretty close to where he was, or could he kill anyone if he knew where they were and was looking at them on a screen? I mean, if he could do that, he shouldn't have any problem quelching the rebellion. Just use the cameras on the probe droids, and you can kill every rebel from the comfort of your insanely gigantic Super Star Destroyer. Speaking of limitations, a lot of the brilliant creativity in this movie comes from special effects restrictions. I'm talking about the original theatrical version, because although I think Empire was the least affected in terms of tone in the special editions, all the model work and other practical effects still leave me awestruck because of how difficult I imagine it had to have been to make all of this look as real as it did in 1980. The model work also gives the world a more gritty, lived-in look and keeps the material visually tied to the old Buck Rogers and Flash Gordon movies it's homaging, while innovating effects that never could have been achieved when those were made. In the commentary, Lucas says that were the scene with Yoda in Luke's backpack made today, he would probably just be a CG creature walking next to Luke, and he says it almost as if he wishes that's what could have been done then. If that decision was made solely because the puppet couldn't move very far, that's a fortunate limitation that led to something that made a lot more sense than that, and is visually more interesting. Yoda would make Luke carry him so that Luke could learn self-reliance, so he wouldn't feel like Yoda was carrying him. Yoda's philosophy seems to work in the practice of this film. It succeeds because it's not constantly taking the easy way out. So why do so many fans consider this the best of the Star Wars movies? Well, I think it's because of that incredible balance it's striking between the fun, absurd space adventure the first movie was and a heavier, more brooding drama. There is a tone shift here, but it's gradual and effortless. And I think it's because this is where the big developments happen. When the movie was first released, a lot of people weren't sure what to think of it without the rest, and it certainly didn't have the reputation for best of the Star Wars movies like it does now. And as I said before, I can't imagine watching this movie now and not knowing where it's all going, let alone having to wait 3 years to find out and not being able to rewatch Empire on home video. Despite my case that Luke and Han do have solid character arcs within this movie alone, it still very much watches like an act a movie. And so picking your favorite is like picking the best third of a movie. You might go for the third act because of a spectacular climax, but the meat of a story is in the confrontation. And so a lot of the major mythology that fans love from this franchise is fleshed out here. I love it for the gambit of emotions it makes me feel, how grim and fun it manages to be sometimes at the same time, its pure creativity, its vast scope, and the richness of this fully realized universe, which feels most rich to me in this movie. I'm not sure I'd give the entire 3-act story full marks, but The Empire Strikes Back gets 4 out of 4 from me.
Should I stay or should I go now? Should I stay or should I go now? If I go, there will be trouble. If I stay, it will be double. So come on and let me know.
Dad, can I have a waffle for Christmas? Like a real one? I promise I'll take care of it and always put it in the garage when I'm done crossing the neighbors for the Empire.